ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how. Well, hello there, my fellow FileMaker learners and developers. This is Matt Petrowski bringing you these FileMaker tutorials from my website, FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video, we're going to take a look at a topic near and dear to my heart, and that is design and theming. And what we're talking about are the default styles, why you shouldn't use them. Or should you? Let's take a look at my file and see what we're talking about. All right, thanks for joining me on my desktop here. You can see I've got the file. This is a theme file, and as many of you know, I also run the website FileMakerThemes.com. I happen to be in the process of updating my theme files, and as I was doing that, it occurred to me that there may be some things that you don't know about theming with regards to how I apply a theme within FileMaker, and I'm going to show you what I know or what you should know about themes. So we'll take a look at the file that we have here. Now, if you're a subscriber to ISO FileMaker Magazine, you will have access to this file. This will be the file that you will get or be able to download. Otherwise, I will be providing the information in this particular video for free because I think it's something that everybody should know about using themes. So let's get into the topic. Now, when we look at this file, as I zoom in, what we're going to see is I've got a lot of extras that maybe you don't take the time when you're either enhancing or working on your own theme. Things like all of the different colors. I like to bring in at least 5 colors or a few more. But you can see that we've got some sections here of defaults. Then we have styled objects, and then I have over here some transparents. Now, in the way that I design, these are the 3 primary categories. But as you can see, the defaults themselves really aren't too exciting. In fact, when I click in here, I get no highlight comes on, nothing comes onto these fields. Now they're arranged as such. I've got a text block or a text object. I have an edit field. I have a pop-up list and then a drop-down menu. And then I have checkboxes, radar buttons, all pretty obvious. But as I go through these, you can see that nothing really happens in these defaults. Where as opposed to these styled objects that I have right here, and I'll tell you how I differentiate them as we go through this video, I click in and I get my highlight. I also have a little bit of a shadow on this particular version right here, where here's the drop-down list. You're able to enter a custom value, but you're also able to select from your options as well. So I can select from here, and I have the arrow. Now, FileMaker has a lot of peculiarities with regards to when and how the arrow shows, or the icon, I should call it. In fact, there is a box, an icon widget right here in this area where my cursor is, and all elements of that can be styled. So I could have a solid color. I chose to use a transparent. But this video is more about the defaults and how it impacts all of your other objects. You can see that I've got a hover here on the radio buttons and the checkboxes and so forth. All of the styling that has been applied to these styled objects as opposed to these defaults is such that I will design in my layouts using explicitly named styles, but I almost never try to use defaults. And I'm going to guess that you're probably using defaults, and here's why. Let's go into layout mode on this file. We'll zoom out. Make the file a little bit smaller thanks to the sidebars. FileMaker now has to draw those. And if I could get that to size up, we would be able to see what's going on. So I'll create a new layout here, and I'll just call this blank. Actually, I don't want to do this on my theme file. I'm going to create a new file, and we're going to work with that. All right, I've created my blank file, and we can go through what is probably a typical process for you. I'll go into layout mode, and I'm going to put some of these fields on the layout. I'm going to grab them. Maybe I'll choose some of my options down here. Maybe I don't want any labels, and maybe I want the labels aligned to the above or however. Actually, that doesn't look really good. Let's go and select all of these in a normal. There we go. We've got our labels. Now, what happens in FileMaker is by default, the default is used whenever you put something new onto a layout. So when we select this, and let's say make sure we can see the inspector area, and we can see our styles. When I select this field, we can see that it is set to the default by default. When I drag it from the side over here, into the layout, FileMaker uses the default. In fact, FileMaker is encouraging bad use of the theme, and you're going to see why here when I show you with working with my theme, why I never design with defaults, but you probably are. Because FileMaker quite simply encourages you to use the default. So I can drag a field that's up here right out like this, and I can specify this new field as whatever I want. I'll say that I want this to be the time created on. I'll double click, and lo and behold, I select this field, and it is the default. FileMaker across the board is wanting you, or not wanting you, it's pushing you towards using the default. But here's my argument. Don't use the default, because the default is the only place where certain settings that can be global in nature are controlled. And here is the example. What I'm going to do is I am going to take a copy of this. Now we are using the Enlightened theme. This is FileMaker's own theme. And in most all of FileMaker's themes, they do follow what should be applied to themes. In fact, there's really only, I think, myself that provides themes through FileMaker Themes, things beyond what you can get from FileMaker. When I make a new copy of this field, I'll just say OK here. I don't like that the dialog box is really it's not showing there. OK. And I'll get the label out of the way. We now have two defaults, but what I'm going to do is I'm now going to style this object. I'm going to go to the inspector, and I'm just going to give it a fill. Let's say it's going to be orange, and I'm now going to save this as a new style. Let's make sure that I can see right here. I'm going to save as a new style. And what I'm going to do is that came on somewhere. In fact, this specify style box goes all over the place. I'm now going to call this style relative to what the object is. So right here I have a field. The field is of a type edit box. We can see right here, whenever you change an object to one of the different widget styles is what I'm going to call them, the styles for that widget do differ. So in other words, an edit box is distinctly different than a drop down, which is different than a popover, different than the radio boxes and the check boxes. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this new style default edit box, and I'm going to say OK. Now there are few settings that if you change them on the default, you never have the opportunity to cascade them or be able to make wide sweeping changes, which is the whole purpose of cascading style sheets. Wait, cascading style sheets? Yep. That's what FileMaker uses behind the scenes. FileMaker made a really good choice to use CSS or cascading style sheets such that a root or a base object, whatever settings are on that object will be inherited by all children of that object. And provided you don't explicitly set something on that object, the change to the root object or the base object will flow to all other objects. Case in point, I will make another variation of this field. I'll just say it's the created by. It doesn't matter what the field is. And on this one, I'll change it to a color of green. And what I will do is I will now save this as yet another new style. Save as a new style. And that wonderful box loves to come up wherever it wants to go. I will call this one edit box green. Now you notice what I've done here is I've created two different variations here. I've got something that I've chosen to use the word default edit box, and then I've chosen to call this one just simply what the field is, edit box green, giving it a color. Now a lot of the times using the color as part of the definition, this goes to the world of CSS, isn't always the best choice because it's so specific that somewhere in the design process, if you don't like green, you end up choosing blue. This name no longer works. So I'll give you some tips about that coming up here, but I'm going to revert this really quickly, revert the changes to the style, and show you what I'm talking about never using the defaults. And we'll go back to the theme file and I'll explain how and why this happens. On this particular object, there are settings that it has in order to define for all other children objects that are inherited. One of those settings is the font setting. the actual font that is used. So what's going to happen is now I'm going to need to save this theme. I'm going to save the changes to the theme, and in nice confusing format, I did not save to the actual Enlightened theme. I've discussed this in the past before. Even though this continues to say Enlightened, as soon as I selected that red box, FileMaker made a copy of the Enlightened theme. We can see that because when we go into the theme by clicking here, we can see that we now have this custom Enlightened, whereas opposed to as we scroll down, we have some other items in there. We have the original Enlightened, which is right there. I don't know why I needed to scroll. So there is the theme that we started with. It's a copy of a FileMaker theme. It gets converted into a custom theme with the same name, and it doesn't prompt you. I think FileMaker should prompt you, so that's an important thing to note if you didn't know that. But now that I have my custom theme, it has its own ID, when I select this object of default, had I never used that within my user interface, changing the font on the default is going to cascade to all of these other objects. So I'll select over here, we'll hide the graphic, we'll hide advanced, and we will change this from Arial to something that's a little more obvious. I'm going to type in Courier, because Courier is it's a monospace font. It'll be very obvious. As soon as I change the settings to the default by saving the changes to the current style, you notice that all other fields based off of that particular field, the default, gets the update. So provided I never make a change of the font on any children field, children styles, I get the advantage that there are certain things that I have control over. And we will take a look at that when we look at the theme, and I will show you some of the other settings that make it really nice to design when you don't use the defaults. So now let's watch what happens if we had, if we selected on this, and we actually gave this an explicit font of, let's say, this one right here, Arahoni. It's nice, Aharoni. It's a nice solid font. Now we're doing this based off of the child of the default, which is what we called default edit box. So if we save this to the style now, and we now save to the theme, now when we go to the default, what's going to happen? The only thing that it's going to cascade down to is the default itself and any child who has not received an explicit font setting, meaning I no longer have control over the font family for this particular field because it has now been explicitly set to something distinctly different than the default itself. So I now switch the default back to Arial. I didn't like Courier, and I say Save Changes, and I do not have something that flowed. So this gets back to my original remark that you should not design your design with defaults. And that's what I'm putting into all of my themes. They are not currently over at FileMaker Themes, but I am going to be releasing new themes that follows this format. And we're going to see another reason why this is so advantageous if you don't design with defaults. If you instead take the advantage to use the defaults as your controlling mechanism for global changes. What I'm saying here is I'm not suggesting that you not use a font, but I'm suggesting that you attempt as much as possible to keep the defaults as the overriding method for being able to make global sweeping changes. Of course, you're going to have fields that you're going to want to set that will have a different font or a different weight. But if you wanted to cascade to all of these fields and say, you know what, I want all of them to all at one time be able to use bold, you want to be able to do this. Save the changes and then save the theme, and it just goes across the whole file for a particular field or object. Now, of course, if I switch this by using the fourth area and switching this from an edit box to a drop-down list, we can see that what's happening is it too is inheriting from that style setting on this. If on a drop-down list, I go back over and I say, no, I don't want drop-down lists to be bold. And if I select this one and I make it a pop-up menu, so we've got here a drop-down list. We'll go ahead and include the arrow so that we can see it. And we've got this one. You can see that the pop-up menu itself also is not taking that now. It really is weird in terms of how it decides things. Let's see, we'll save the changes to that style. And now we'll save to the theme. Now what happens is we're going to be able to say, set this to a non-bold characteristic. Let's go back to regular. We'll save the changes. It will save everything else, but these now will not be affected because I have on a drop-down list default, I have explicitly stated that this style is going to be regular. It will not and cannot be bold. So what I've done to my theme now is I have now prevented myself from being able to say I want all fields to now all of a sudden be bold, save those changes, and then override them. It is now, from the point of me making that one change, it is now no longer possible for me to set the default drop-down list or the default pop-up menu to use bold. Although if I set bold on this particular instance of the default for the pop-up menu, it will cascade to all children that are pop-up menus, unless that particular child pop-up menu has explicitly been set to use regular versus bold. So, having said that, let's now go over the theme file and see what type of sweeping universal changes you can make when you don't use defaults and instead set up your own stylized versions of all of the individual objects. All right, so here's what I love about when you have this information, then you know what you should do while you're developing a user interface instead of having to have this mess that you then have to go and stylize multiple objects. So as I zoom in on this note, what we're going to see is down here, we can see cascading values. I'm putting a note directly in my theme files that tries to teach you what I'm teaching you in this video. And I know some people won't read this, that there are settings that if you leave them on the defaults, you have universal control, sweeping control over the whole of a theme. And those include the font face, we can see here the font size, the font style, that's bold versus plain, and border radius. Now this is what's really cool. Watch what happens in this file if I never use the defaults on my layouts. What I'm using is I'm using a styled version of the default. And if I accidentally make a mistake and I give this a font family by going to the control panel here and selecting the font family and setting it, I haven't messed things up for myself, meaning I didn't set it on the default. The default is still what cascades to all other children objects because all other children objects spawn off of the default. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's play with these. Number one, let's take the button right here. So in this column that I have right here of defaults, I have one of each of the objects. And on my layouts, you will rarely, if ever, find the word default as the name of the style because I just don't want to use them. You will find edit box. In fact, let's go over here and let's see what they're named. I'll size this so we can see right here. So I have chosen to name this default dropdown, default pop-up, default checkbox, default radio button. I have created a new unique style off of the default for each of the objects, leaving the defaults here on the theme so that I can do exactly what we're going to see right now. Buttons are great examples for this. So I will scroll over and I now currently have all of these buttons, and currently all of my buttons are square. Within a few changes, I can select my default button, which is never used on any of my layouts that I design. What's actually used is my custom style of default button. But as a child, this child, transparents don't really count. Those in my themes are special objects. But this button, this button, this button, all of them. You can see right here as I select, if you look at the video and watch right here, we've got button color 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then we've got a gradient variant 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's say that in this theme, I would like to have more of a rounded pill button look. And I really would like the buttons to stand out. I'd like their text to be really strong. So rather than setting it on my style or on any one of the given styles, which is, well, we've got 5 here, we've got 10 here, 10 total styles, including this one, 11 styles, not including the outlines down here. I just go to this one object and I say, yep, I'd like to have this one be bold. And I would also like to have this be rounded on the corners. Now what I'm going to do is a trick here and set this to 100. And I'm going to round this. I am now going to save the default style, which I don't use on any of my layouts. And as you will see, instantly, I just got the cascade. I got the cascade such that my default button became rounded with bold text, and all other variants got those properties. This is the intention of cascading styles. But in most cases, what developers have done, when they stylize the default and then spawn children off of that default, by setting the settings on the children, they have lost the opportunity to make sweeping changes all at once. And I really like this feature. I like the fact that I can go into my main theme layout, which is usually my first layout in my file, and say, you know what, let's take a look at what this looks like with a rounded corner look versus a hard edge look. You know what, that's a little too hard. I don't like the pill look. Let's just go with a 7-point radius. I'll make that 7 points. I'll save it in one place, and everything will flow throughout the whole design. And within one change, you can make a very hard edge, square-looking design go to a round-looking design. And if you want to, you can style things in whatever fashion you want. So if I don't want bold by just taking it off on the default, that will cascade to all other objects and I get my regular style. Don't like Arial, that's fine. I'll change it to Calibri. Actually, let's choose something else. Let's choose the Arahoni, and let's go ahead and save that current style, and it'll flow to all of the objects, as you can see right here. Now, that is the advantage, and that is what I'm suggesting that you do. I think I've belabored the point at this point in time. This file is going to be available, as I stated, to subscribers. This does apply to FileMaker as well. FileMaker's themes do a really good job of this. If I switch over to this and I was to choose, FileMaker chooses to use the Enlightened, but the Universal Touch is a theme that is one that FileMaker put on newer files. I'll change this file to that and we'll see if this follows that format. All right, so let's go through the process. I've switched this to the Universal Touch theme, one that's provided by FileMaker. I'm going to use my objects. I mean, really all you have to have is the objects in one place. I'm going to select all of them here. I have them in a nice column ready for me to use. It's one of each of everything. I'll just copy that. I'll go over to the other file. I will paste it right here. So I've got all of the objects. Obviously the fields aren't stylized. We can see that obviously the scroll bars change in terms of the styles that are used. I should note, one of the things that I do on my themes by intention is that in all of FileMaker design, there is one thing that you cannot control, and that are the scroll bars. Once the scroll bars are set in the main theme file, you cannot set them ever again. So using this Universal Touch, you're stuck with pretty much these scroll bars. In fact, choose a theme based on its scroll bars. So, because that's the one thing you can't control, everything else you can control. But with all of these default objects in here, and with them styled, I can see that this particular object, it is remembering the fact that some custom style was saved on that object before it was saved to the theme. We can also double check and confirm that by seeing that the default here has the little red icon. So we're going to revert the changes on that button so that it becomes a default button. That also has a default. We'll not save that style. We want to revert on that one, revert the changes. So all of these look like the objects I need to revert all of them. Let's see if we can do multiple. And we can. Always do things in bulk if you can. I'll just do a Command A, select all, and I'm going to revert changes to style. That's going to set all of them to a default. In fact, did you notice that calendar? There's so many things that are specific to a theme. This in the theme files that I'm providing, watch what happens when I take this and I'll just make it a field and I will just increase the size. This is something that these are things that you can control that FileMaker doesn't necessarily control in some of their themes. Watch what happens as I increase the size of this field. Notice that the calendar icon is actually getting bigger as well as I increase the size, so that I can size the field such that the calendar icon, it gets bigger as the text gets bigger. That is something that can be controlled, but it cannot be controlled within the inspector palette, and FileMaker doesn't even put this on their own themes, which I don't know why they don't, but it can be done. So when we select all of these objects and we revert them to their styles, you'll notice that the calendar icon right here, and this is just an aside, I don't know why I got distracted by this other than the fact that I saw it and I know it, and it's nice for you to know it. Watch what happens when I increase the size of this field. You'll notice that the calendar icon does not change size. In fact, all it does is it just shifts down. The calendar will stay constant. So I like the fact that you can control things about that within the theme, but it is frustrating that there are things that you can't, such as the scroll bars. But with all of these objects now, what I would do is I've said I like the universal touch theme. I'm going to use it. I'm going to put all of these default objects onto a layout. In fact, let's just give some of these a field. I don't need to give all of them a field, but I'll double click. The universal touch actually is a theme that was designed for touch, so it's going to have much larger fonts. It may not work for you for desktop, but we can still see what's going to happen. So for each of these objects, all of the defaults, I will take a copy of all of these when I'm creating my theme. So just create a copy of each of them, and I will now apply the styles that I want to that make them the defaults that I want to use. So for this edit box, I know it needs to be a larger thing. One thing that FileMaker doesn't do in its themes that I don't like, I do not like that they do not use vertical centering for fields. The vast majority of your fields, when you put them onto a layout, are single line fields. About the only time that you want to use a multi-line field is when you switch an edit box, which a lot of developers don't necessarily know this either. The only difference between an edit box and a text area is the fact that when you go to this area right here and you choose this option of show vertical scroll bar, it is simply turning on a scroll bar, but these two objects, independent of the fact that this one will read as edit box and this one will read as scrolling edit box, under the scenes, both essentially use some of the same settings according to the CSS. But in this scenario, for a scrolling edit box, I want the text to be aligned to the top, but for a normal edit box, I want that to be vertically centered because I want to be able to make the height of the box. But you notice that FileMaker's default is to simply align everything up to the top. I'm not a fan of that. In fact, in all of my themes, you will find that I set this box to be vertically centered, and then I adjust padding based on focus and when you click and so forth. But with the copies of those fields, what I do is right next to them, that's when I give it the styling that I want. Now, FileMaker has already styled the default. We can see that because when we go into browse mode, they have said the styling that I'm going to give you is this. You are going to have only a bottom border showing, and the focus color is going to be, when you click in, that focus color is going to go blue. I would prefer that styling, or I do prefer that styling, not to be on the default. I would prefer to have the default not have any borders and be transparent, then style an object first, which I call my default edit box as I've shown you, and then be able to go on from that, because what that does is it preserves the default for those sweeping changes, as we've already seen. So that is my method right there. I will have one of each object. The defaults will stay the defaults, such as the font. Then I will style this however I want. Let's say on this particular object, I want to have all of the borders on for this particular variation of the field. I'm going to save this one, and I'm going to save it as a new style. Find that specified style name. I'll call this one default edit box. Basically, all I'm doing is I'm combining the word of default, which FileMaker uses, which cannot be changed, to the name of the object. If it was a drop down, then I would call it a drop down. If it was a pop-up, then I call it a pop-up. You just call it whatever it is. You don't have to use the word default, but that's just my convention that I use. edit box, say OK. And then now that I've got this styled, now I save the changes to the theme. FileMaker just saved it, but I still have that overriding change, even using FileMaker's feature here. So we'll say that's going to be created by, of course, it's probably a calendar field. It's still an edit box, which is good. And I'll give this one a background color of whatever, and I will save this as a new style, and I'll call it colored edit box, but I still have universal control, meaning if I want to go to the default and set the default to Arahoni, and I want to save that default, it will cascade to all of the other fields, and that's what you want to take advantage of. So I've really beat this video up, but that is what we have available. Hopefully it has helped you out with regards to how you theme. These are the things that I really don't touch on any children objects, and they are right here. I've already showed you those. The font face, the font size, the font style, and the border radius. If those are things that I can reserve and leave for the defaults, then I do not touch them unless I explicitly know that I need to set it on a particular object. In the case of fields, if I want a heavier font, I think to myself, is this something that I want controlled at the default level, or is this something that I truly want to set on this, knowing that when I change the default, it will not cascade to this particular object? I should make mention of the transparency. One of the things that I do put in all of the themes is a transparent class of objects. In fact, when you select on each of these, if we look at the styles, just like with the default that you find in FileMaker, no matter what the object is, when you select on it, whether it's a edit box, a drop down, what have you, they all have the exact same name of transparent. You can see that right here as I select on each of these buttons. They have a long list of buttons, but you can see that each one of these have a transparent. Transparents are objects that you almost inevitably need within your FileMaker designs. You want something where you have a popover that when you click it, you're able to show something that comes up, but you don't want to know that it's a popover like that right there. It's a trick. You can have something show up on screen where you don't even show the button, but something just comes up in front of things because you've got a transparent popover right here, which can be above this field. That's a pretty cool trick that you want to be able to use. So having one of each of all of FileMaker's objects as transparent is super helpful, and all of these objects have on them explicit settings for most everything. In other words, their corners are usually fixed, although with this selected, I can see that I don't have the corners on buttons transparent set. I do allow those to cascade, but definitely borders and focus and fill and pressed and all of the different states, those have all been set to a transparent state so that the object always stays transparent, meaning it never reveals. And that's just another thing that I like about designing with FileMaker. I like having a complete set of transparents for all of the UI widgets. But okay, wow, I think you've got it. So much luck to you, and until next time, happy FileMaking. We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.